So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay. We make a return today to a pitch battle showcase, which is going to have something of a theme, once again, as is the way with a lot of these Silmarillion showcases, because there are quite a few elven factions involved. Very often we end up with this sort of kinslaying kind of a theme. Although on this occasion it is going to be a little bit more of a SINDAR versus NOLDOR showdown here on a map we actually haven't seen before, so that should be fairly interesting. There's this central area which constricts into this rather narrow pathway in between these two water features here, and then the sides of the map are a little bit more traditional field battle with a few patches of woodland, but overall the terrain being rather flat and even, so that should be rather interesting. As is the way with things though, I think there are some blurred lines even with regards to the SINDAR versus NOLDOR split here, because I think the Falathrim, I think both are involved in this faction unless I'm very much mistaken. I do believe there is a NOLDOR component with their heavier units, though remains to be seen whether their heavier units have even been brought, but generally speaking, broad strokes, that will of course be the difference between the two sides today. The blue team, or purple team as it is in Silmarillion, being the SINDAR, they're going to be a little bit lighter, a little bit more revolving around skirmishing, maybe lightfoot units, a bit more hit and run, and maybe not taking quite so many upfront engagements and trying to pick and pull the NOLDOR armies apart, which generally speaking, once again, it's not the be-all and end-all, but generally speaking are going to be a little bit heavier, a little bit more willing to take those upfront engagements, and a little bit more resilient all round, though of course this can compromise them in certain other ways as well, a little bit less mobile perhaps. But considering this is a pitch battle, we will start with the blue team, the SINDAR, and we shall start with Leech here, who sent me this battle replay, as well as another one, which we'll get onto in a moment as well in the coming weeks. But he's going to be playing as Mithrim. Mithrim as well, much like Finarfin in the last showcase that we saw. Functionally speaking, they haven't really changed, though stylistically they have a little bit. So yeah, the Sword Bearers of Mithrim, a standard unit of line infantry, so they're going to be pretty good in this sort of situation, but again, with Silmarillion being what it is, and the interactions between the varying factions being a little bit different, of course, in standard Third Age stuff, regular, an elven faction with regular infantry, you can realistically expect them to probably be better in terms of quality than what is across from them, though of course in Silmarillion very often the quality levels are fairly similar, and that's going to be the case here. I believe we saw that they're going to be going up against Gondolin, so Gondolin is going to be an interesting opponent for Mithrim to try and face, because they're not going to be able to rely on pure muscle. Their units are not going to fold by any means, but neither are they going to be able to outright overpower Gondolin with their varying and strong high-level infantry, so we're going to have to see the Sword Bearers that perform above and beyond in that regard. We've got the Scions of Tuor in and amongst them as well, one of the high-tier infantry option really for Mithrim. They're a very interesting kind of unit in the sense that very low armour values, defensively maybe not the best in spite of the large shields they have, but they do have some pretty hefty armour-piercing damage that they can deal, which should be very, very useful in this kind of situation, though the weaknesses they have in terms of armour do need to be compensated for, which is probably why we're seeing them embedded in the more numerous and more armoured units of Sword Bearers here. We have the Lookouts of Mithrim. Mithrim's archers, of course, have got some fantastic range on them, which should stand them in pretty good stead against Gondolin. Gondolin have limited archers available to them when it comes to pure skirmishing, and those archers tend to be very, very expensive, and their numbers are not very high, so as we mentioned at the start, missile troops are probably going to be falling more into the SINDAR's way of thinking here. Lookouts of Mithrim making the first forays there. Shore Riders of Mithrim, so some mounted javelin cavalry. Of course, the cavalry of Gondolin, once again, with regard, as you'd expect from a faction like Gondolin, high end, but relatively limited in terms of numbers. So the Shore Riders will be hoping to skirmish with them potentially and limit their impact, used perhaps in a more defensive standpoint to try and safeguard the very important archers. The Hewing Guildsmen of Androth, when previously we've seen Mithrim take to the field, this has probably been the unit which has been most impressive from a melee standpoint, because they do have the numbers, they have the armour piercing in melee, very, very savage in melee in fact, and this is exactly the kind of damage which they're going to need to be doing against a force like Gondolin in order to try and equalise against them. And of course there are the other factions on display as well, which they may have to deal with, the likes of Fingolfin coming across here as well. Artillery, more Hewing Guildsmen manning the crew, being the crew, so that's going to be something else which they can use later on, though the artillery itself will also perhaps pull the opposition army where they want them, and of course that means potentially more missile troops to be used well. Hunters of Mithrim as well, so more javelins, though perhaps in a more skirmishing capacity. We shall see. There's also going to be some shock cavalry here, and another unit which has got a little bit of a makeover as well, the bannerets of the Hither Shore. Rather interesting kind of weapon they have here, an interesting mix between like a morning star and a spear. Interesting to see how they get on. Like I said, Gondolin's cavalry at the high end is very, very powerful, though the bannerets here are no slouches either, so if Gondolin have skimped on their cavalry, it's a sort of area where Mithrim could claim a bit of an edge. And we have some tunnel runners here as well, which are more of an ambush troop. They've got a dual-wielding setup, very, very limited armour of course, but if they can get in and amongst the enemy ranks, they should do a decent job there. Now then, General Artorius playing as the Falathrim, so we've got the Marines of Brithombar as well, so again, some lighter javelin troops. That damage can really pile up over a longer period of time, should the enemy let it. Much of the Falathrim, however, have decided to post up here in this middle pass to at least contest it with Fingolfin to try and make sure that the red team don't get too much map control. Rangers of Brithombar are a lighter archer unit again. Like I said, it'll be interesting to see if the Falathrim have decided to bring their heavier units. If they have, they can more than go toe-to-toe at long range with a force like Fingolfin. If they haven't, then the Rangers are probably a little bit light to be trying to do that sort of work all on their own. But the Marines will add some more close-range punch as well. Plenty of javelins here at the Falathrim's disposal, when the Marines of Aglarest also have that sort of thing at their disposal. More medium javelin troops, this of course with spears as well, not going to be too bad at holding the line either, as most spears in any medieval 2 variants aren't, but we'll see. Again, Fingolfin have got plenty of pretty scary options in melee, not the easiest foe to try and deal with. Once again, we're seeing more of a catapult presence as well, so if they get sort of set up in the middle there, it could make the advance of Fingolfin a little bit more dicey. A couple of units of champions of Aglarest as well, so some standard medium melee cavalry. Like I said, it really does depend on what the Noldor cavalry have decided to bring to the table, but this is the sort of unit which, again, if used in a more defensive standpoint, can really help safeguard a lot of these missile troops, which the blue team here seem to be trafficking in. And there's a few units way back here as well. Yeah, the Iran Kia Lim, 2 units of them. I believe these are technically Noldor troops, so these are the only ones that are deciding to fight for the Sindar today. General's unit as well. They're not multiple HP, interestingly enough, but their stats are still very high. And they do represent the heaviest units, probably the heaviest units that the blue team have access to overall today. Especially when you consider that the other force we're seeing, which we're not going to be seeing a great deal of them under the command of Tundra's Fox, is going to be Ossiriand, because much of their force is going to be hidden. Though it must be said, the Kinsmen of Denethor are pretty bulky, and they are, possibly with the exception of the Mithrim, the most dependable frontline combatant that Ossiriand have. From a defensive standpoint, it's certainly the Kinsmen, though the maces of the Mithrim would probably be very useful against the likes of Finarfin. Though, like I said, that's pretty much it from what we can see of Ossiriand. Obviously, when they've got this much in the way of vegetation to sheathe themselves in, they've got Mithrim and Gondolin in there, so good to see they have brought them. But yes, we'll have to wait and see what Ossiriand have in store, though. Understandably, I think it's going to be a lot of archers and a lot of trying to move back and forth a little bit, because it's pretty much the mirror opposite to the force we're going to look at now in Finarfin, whereas Ossiriand like to move around and shoot their opponents up and then only move in for the kill with some high damage infantry when the time is good and right. Finarfin, on the other hand, when it comes to holding a defensive position and that more traditional, more plodding perhaps style of warfare, Finarfin are one of the very best at doing that sort of thing, though they're not completely helpless at long range either. The split shots on the marksmen of Nargothrond could be a real problem for the light Ossiriand elves should they get caught out in the open in a more standard skirmish fight, though of course the ability to hide anywhere and in the trees does limit the marksman's options there, though they may decide to link up with their allies more directly instead. Probably the most impressive frontline force that we're going to be seeing on the field today, a mixture of the armour-piercing Wardens of Nargothrond and the Bridge Wards of Nargothrond, one of the very few units of pikes in the game. A very effective frontline indeed, though the armour-piercing element to them may be less important here. Not completely going to waste against the Falathrim, but mostly going to waste against Ossiriand in all fairness. The new version of the Defenders of Talath Dianin as well. I mean, javelins on both sides here are going to be getting into range of one another and really letting one another know where they are, because again, as javelins, especially with more skirmishing javelins like this, there is more of an emphasis on that in Silmarillion, I find. Warns of Nargothrond here, a detachment of them, half strength but also half price. Sartor Finderato are fairly similar actually to the Kinsmen of Denethor, though the Sartor are stronger all round. I mean, that does make a little bit of sense because this is more along the lines of what you'd expect from House Finarfin. Bodyguard, a genuine bodyguard unit as well in the Sartor. We also have some Swordsmen of Talathdin in here as well, very similar to the Spear variant we've already seen. More marksmen, more bridge wards and wardens, more defenders and more wardens. I mean, Stewie is set up here in anticipation of an attack, though I'd be extremely surprised if Ossiriand took the initiative here. They're going to be waiting for their enemies to be drawn into the traps that they have undoubtedly laid. Now then, the central army we have is House Fingolfin. Once again, a little bit of a reskin job has been done on them, Captain Gervais playing as them. Marksmen of Barad-Ithel, no frills on these guys really. We've seen split shot projectiles already in this battle so far. We've seen very long range archers from Mithrim, plenty of hidden archers as well, which undoubtedly we will see from Ossiriand. But the Marksmen of Barad-Ithel are just a straight up heavy archer, which are very dependable at what they do, and in all fairness, based on the units which we can see from the Falathrim, that will be enough for them to secure range dominance potentially if it turns into that sort of slugfest back and forth over here. We also have some throwing axes in the Dragon Guard of Dor Lomin. That should be really good actually against the vast majority of the Sindar units we can see before us today. Again, more heavily armoured units would maybe be a little bit more effective against standard axe throws at the very least, but the Dragon Guard, I think they counteract that as well by having armour piercing, so they're just a pretty damn dangerous unit all round, and obviously they can hold their own in melee as well, so pretty good choice in terms of what they are offering today. You can see here the Bladesmen of Barad-Ithel with their new look shields along with the Sentries of Hithlum, so pikes, certainly the sort of thing which the red team are going to have in their favour. So like I said, if the battle gets bogged down into a pure melee affair, then the Noldor factions should have the edge here, although of course human pikes in the case of Fingolfin here, backed up by the Bladesmen, so a standard but very effective frontline arrangement there. Blade Masters are of course the heavy swordsman variant. They're going to be particularly effective against the lighter troops that they perceive today. Interesting to see how the Sindar intend to deal with them. Javelins would probably be the best way, and then undoubtedly there's going to be more hidden units from Fingolfin in and amongst these trees over here, though also another wing of the army over here including Dragon Guard, more Blade Masters, and actually we do have the Mighty Sons of Hurin. I think they have the strongest charge bonus of any footbound infantry unit in the game. I think there are some units which have since supplanted them in terms of armor-piercing damage, perhaps from the likes of Valinor, but still one of the very scariest units, and certainly the most impressive human unit that Silmarillion has to offer. And then 2 units of the Armitar of Barad-Ithel as well, a slightly souped-up version of the standard Bladesmen. Individually anyway, they are of course half strength. They also boost the morale of nearby units. And last, but by no means least, probably the fan favourite faction, I would say, in Silmarillion as a whole, the hidden city of Gondolin under the command of Lion of Iron. Axemen of the Pillar, I like this choice. The axes, of course, they trade in a little bit of defence for offence against more lightly armoured forces, and that is what Mithrim classify as. So I think the Axemen of the Pillar, while they don't offer the same level of resilience that some of the other Gondolin units have, I like the fact that the first line, at the very least, is based around them, because they should do fairly well against most of what Mithrim have to offer. It is interesting to see the Armourers of the Hammer, maybe the other end of the spectrum here, in which I'm not sure I would have picked these guys. They are very expensive. They do offer armour piercing, and they are significantly more defensively oriented than the Axemen of the Pillar, but they mostly find their niche against more heavily armoured factions. It's not to say that armour piercing will go completely to waste against their foes today, but based on cost efficiency I maybe wouldn't have suggested bringing quite so many of them, but it does mean that they have a pretty scary front line here of many shielded units, so that is the sort of thing which could also take away a bit of the effectiveness of those Mithrim archers. Maybe that was the thinking here. Champions of the Fountain, particularly dangerous. The relentless trait means they can't be flinched in combat, effectively hyper armour, and yeah, they should do really, really well against most of what Mithrim has to offer, pretty much all of what Mithrim has to offer. And as if that wasn't enough, there's also the Mighty Lords of the Golden Flower, a very small unit, but 3 HP, one of the very finest units in class that the game has to offer. And of course, if they get in and amongst things, which undoubtedly they will find their way into melee, it's just whether or not they get picked apart on the advance, but very, very strong unit of singular infantry indeed. There's a few units further back here, and indeed cavalry, a big investment here into 2 units of Knights of the Golden Flower. They are very, very scary, and based on this, the cavalry advantage should be held by Gondolin, even with some of the investment that Mithrim have put in maybe we'll need a little bit of support from the Falathrim cavalry as well, because if they start charging in with their very, very dangerous lance charges, then it's going to be pretty difficult, I think, for Mithrim to withstand that sort of thing. I mean, they have some cavalry defence, but not that much, honestly, other than their own cav, and that may get overwhelmed, but we shall see. I can't imagine we're going to need to make too much of a cut here. It is a field battle and the armies are fairly close together. We'll see, though, and we'll rejoin when the first blows are being struck. So I think we will just rejoin right from the get-go here. This isn't the longest battle after all, and given the rather large range advantage that in particular Mithrim are going to hold over on this side of the field, I can't imagine it's going to be too long before this battle gets underway. And to be fair, I think this kind of map that it is does slightly favour the Sindar just in terms of their ability to skirmish here. And in particular, I think for Finarfin it's going to be a rather laborious affair if they decide to try and stick to this 1v1 situation on all thirds of the map, purely because Ossiriand are very well suited for this kind of thing. Outriders of Dweil when moving along. In many ways, actually, I think Finarfin would probably be best off simply consolidating themselves entirely with Fingolfin, and if the Noldor can take the middle of the map here, which is a little bit more constricting, they can make the battle go in a way that would maybe be a little bit more palatable for them. Scouts of the Tree revealing themselves, so that's going to be a ranged unit, a unit of slingers of course, which have not the best attacks in melee, but still that's more armour piercing. The slingers themselves will be important. The spearmen of the Swallow also revealing themselves, a unit of lighter archers by comparison, but still the kind of archers that Mithrim have. If it comes to purely taking hits off of one another, I can't imagine either side is going to have a hugely distinct advantage. Mithrim, of course, will be wanting to get that extra range off, but they're already in range of the spearmen of the Swallow. Interesting that Gondolin have decided to position themselves over here in this slightly hillier terrain, maybe a little bit more constricting, not as easy for Mithrim to move around, maybe within these little hillocks as well. Gondolin can try and form some pseudo choke points, and then the Knights of the Golden Flower always with the danger to get in behind. So it's a risky proposition this for Mithrim, especially considering the fact they've been slightly pulled away from their supporting allies here. Meanwhile, Scouts of Galleon revealing themselves, as have the Finarfin and Tower, two units of archers that Ossiriand have that can hide. Finarfin moving forward though and being decisive whether or not they decide to join up with Fingolfin in their entirety, or if they decide to try and attack Ossiriand directly. Being decisive is going to be key here, because trying to pick Ossiriand apart is not the easiest task in the world. There's a bit of artillery action going on as well. I would say as well that in terms of a pure skirmish fight, while the Marksmen of Nargothrond certainly have their advantages with those split shots, the damage that Ossiriand can lay down, the number of archers they have, and of course the Finarfin Tower being a slightly higher end unit, although the Scouts of Tauren Faroth as well, adding themselves in another of these lighter archers that come equipped with a spear, fairly multifaceted in what they offer. Poison projectiles as well, though it'll take a little bit more before Ossiriand are going to genuinely think about routing off. Meanwhile, over here, not a huge amount yet between the Falathrim and Fingolfin, kind of unsurprisingly. I'd imagine Fingolfin will probably be the first ones to make a move there. I did see on the mini-map the cavalry did make its way forward, the Knights of the Golden Flower managing to get a charge here into the Sword Bearers of Mithrim, though it must be said, not a huge amount of death inflicted, and indeed there's a fair few riders that have also fallen by the wayside. Not the kind of unit you want to be losing for nothing, and the Mithrim cavalry also now guarding the flanks. Rather interesting actually, in that the catapult is moving forward, but so far the side with the most action has been this one, which I kind of wasn't expecting. I was expecting Ossiriand to maybe take a little bit more of a back seat and not move forward out into the open field to try and meet the challenge of Finarfin should they be a little bit more adventurous like this. There's also a few of the Fingolfin units over here, which might speak to a potential opportunity for the Falathrim to move forward as well. Banking those catapult shots in there, going after the bridge wards, which is unsurprising. Late game, the bridge wards represent probably the most dangerous units on the field. If you have no missiles to take care of them late on and not enough men to overwhelm them, they can be match winners in and of themselves, as high tier pikes often are. Marines of Eglarast, I mean, still Falathrim content so far to simply marshal the middle portion of the map. And they are going to send over some supporting units as well. We are starting to see a little bit of movement. We've got Fingolfin moving over some support. We've got Gondolin now moving forward to get into melee with Mithrim, but very distinct gaps between the two waves by the looks of things here. I mean, I did mention the Axeman of the Pillar should do reasonably well actually against Mithrim, sword bearers here, given the extra damage that the Axeman of the Pillar have, but they're quite constricted here. Mithrim can certainly craft their line a little bit better, and they are going to need to move forward the armourers of the hammer as a second wave fairly quickly, I think. Otherwise, that initial force is simply going to get overwhelmed, and you can see here the Outriders of Dweilwyn moving across. So that's some good interplay between the Sindar factions here. Nice charge, I mean fairly lightweight as far as cavalry goes, but that was a good charge nonetheless. And now they're also going to be able to try and pick away at the next advancing infantry column. As a matter of fact, we are going to go down to half speed just momentarily here, because this is likely to be the busiest section of the battlefield now. Outriders of Dweilwyn retreating back in behind the Mithrim front line, so this will be a fairly stern test of the sword bearers. You wouldn't expect them to beat the armourers of the hammer, even if the heavy armour-piercing infantry maybe isn't the most efficient thing against Mithrim. They are still ultimately a unit of the next quality level up compared to the sword bearers, so when it comes to a simple victory in physical terms, that should be the sort of thing that Gondolin can achieve here, although the Scions of Tuor certainly throw a bit of a fly in the ointment there. Fingolfin coming forward with some support is going to be important as well, especially with units like the Sons of Hurin over there, so it's good to see support is being offered from effectively the central team on both sides, and Fingolfin twinning this as well with forward movement through the middle here. Randirin caught out. Don't want to be losing them, of course. One of the very few, in fact I think still the only body-piercing projectile unit the game has to offer. That's a very short range for the revealing of ambush troops there. Bladesmen of Barad-Ithel should be able to fairly easily defeat Spearmen of Brithombar in pure melee, however, and they aren't going to be able to get their javelins off at close range. Just a single unit of infantry move forward with a little bit of support from Marines of Vinyamar as well, but numbers-wise the Falathrim should still be okay. Rangers of Brithombar have taken a fair amount of losses here as well, raining down with more of those pretty nasty projectiles. This is a little bit more of what I expected initially from Ossiriand, in all fairness. The Scouts of Galleon still firing back and forth, but you can see how the lighter archers here have struggled against the heavy archers, and you can see Marksmen of Barad-Ithel as well. So Fingolfin with their own archers trying to counteract Ossiriand's skirmishing focus, and they have done so. But we haven't really seen the lion's share of Ossiriand's army yet, which is their saving grace. Finarfin will need to move forward, and they will have to worry about Falathrim coming in from the side, and they will also have to worry about what exactly the Elves of Ossiriand have. We know, of course, they've got some Mithrim hidden in there, which should be pretty good against some of the heavier Finarfin troops. Meanwhile over here, lookouts of Mithrim firing away, Armitar of Barad-Ithel moving forward, the Tunnel Runners getting in behind enemy lines, although they have been met by Blade Masters and another of those Armitar of Barad-Ithel units. So as much as this is getting a unit in and around the lines and delaying Fingolfin's full reinforcing column, these Tunnel Runners are still going to find themselves horribly outclassed, especially by a unit like the Blade Masters, and the Dragon Guard are also moving forward, so some pretty nasty stuff, honestly, overall, from Fingolfin's on the way forward. But you can see here these Axemen of the Pillar, I was a little bit concerned about how they decided to move forward, and a little bit isolated they were, and they are struggling a little bit here against Mithrim, especially now that the Hewing Guildsmen are also in melee as well. We mentioned how they really are the heart and soul of all the damage that Mithrim can do in melee, and they will be bleeding away the manpower of these Axemen of the Pillar. Cavalry is also going to be rather interesting to see, though for the most part it does look as though the cavalry has been bashing against one another over on this side. And the Knights of the Golden Flower, one unit still completely healthy, the other unit has been taking some losses. The Shore Riders getting in their way. Bannerets of the Hither Shore have taken some losses as well, though with the expense the cavalry is going to be more important here for Gondolin. But you can see here with a fair amount of these very high-end units, this is also something that Gondolin can very much lean on. even if the situation doesn't go their way on certain parts of the line. As soon as they start to move forward with the Lords of the Golden Flower and the Champions of the Fountain here, there's nothing Mithrim really have that can match them one-to-one. That was always going to be a slight concern when you talk about a Noldor versus Sindar battle. As much as stuff like the Mithrim and Gondolin, the Hewing Guildsmen of Androth here, as much as they do have damage on their side, they don't have the same balanced quality that the highest level Gondolin, Fingolfin and Finarfin troops tend to have, and the Lords of the Golden Flower in particular, while very expensive, are going to be very, very dangerous to these light and medium troops that Mithrim do tend to traffic in, medium troops mainly. In come the Sons of Húrin as well. The armour piercing was always going to struggle to find its niche here. It's really only the Aran Kier limb of the Falathrim that would be hyper effective against, but the pure damage values and of course the multiple HP nature of this unit is still going to be of great concern to the Hewing Guildsmen and the Sword Bearers, and they have managed to bail out the beleaguered Axemen of the Pillar with that extra quality, and Fingolfin as they start to move forward. Mithrim still have a fair amount of numbers to their name, and lookouts of Mithrim are here, the Catapult, Falathrim as well, shooting into the side. It's going to have to be these imperceptible levels of damage slowly adding up over time here, I think, which is going to have to give Mithrim the assistance they need, because especially with these Fingolfin reinforcements and the high quality units Gondolin are bringing to the table now, I do worry about the future of the Mithrim position. We'll see. I mean, in particular, Scouts the Tree, the Dragon Guard of Dorloman are going to be nasty. There goes a Mithrim general, face down in the dirt. What have we got here? Here in the middle we do have Randirim, who are trying to shoot right down the line, and they will be successful in that. I mean, it's not surprising to see once again the Noldor factions are the ones claiming the edge in melee, Spearmen of Brythonbar holding the line, but a combination of a really solid unit of line infantry and the Bladesmen, backed up by the anchor points of the sentries of Hithlum. That was always going to be a better front line than the ones that the Falathrim could lay on, especially with the more limited amounts of Noldor that they are able to bring here. The Randirim could end up doing an awful lot of damage. The Marines of Vinyamar going after the Marines of Eglarest as well. Meanwhile over here, Fingolfin and Finarfin still content to sort of leave it be for the time being. I think they will probably feel emboldened by the fact that they're probably going to gain the momentum on the right hand side of the map, and in the middle, provided the missiles can't get into a really nasty position, they should also slowly start to turn the Sindar back here as well. So there's no immediate rush for them to be aggressive across the entirety of the field. So I can appreciate them holding back a little bit for now. Marines of Vinyamar throwing their jabbies in, but it is still over here where really the most important engagement still is. Shore Riders of Mithrim fleeing. 8 Knights of the Golden Flower remain. I like the fact that 1 unit of cavalry is being held in reserve for the time being. There's still a fair amount of danger to be had over here, and they have used a lot of this 1 unit, routing off the Shore Riders as well, although this I think will be the end of this unit of Knights now. Finally the Bannerets of the Hither Shore will finish them off, but they've got a whole other unit of cavalry to deal with, so you would still back the red team here to win the cavalry engagement overall. And these Armourers of the Hammer, they have taken a fair amount of damage, but their own armour has helped them weather a fairly nasty storm, and then when the heavy swordsmen came forward, you can see Sword Bearers of Mithrim doing their best. I mean, the Scions of Tuor are actually still completely healthy, which is fairly surprising. I think they've been mostly up against the Armourers after all. But against the heavy sword units, Champions of the Fountain, Knights of the Golden Flower, you would imagine that would be exactly the kind of unit that the Scions would be quite poor against, bodyguard to bodyguard. But the Lords of the Golden Flower are simply moving backwards and trying to go after all these skirmishers, which of course they will absolutely tear limb from limb in pure melee terms. But the further back behind enemy lines they go, the more isolated they are, and the easier perhaps it will be for the Sindar to pick them apart with skirmishers from multiple angles. And the Lords of the Golden Flower, they are taking a lot of damage actually. Those javelins really starting to add up in terms of damage, so chasing the enemy too far perhaps. And we did mention earlier on, of course, that those imperceptibles damage being done over time with missiles, which is hard to keep track of, could be the saving grace of the SINDAR, and that is starting to look like the case. The hefty assault that Gondolin and Fingolfin eventually got rolling here was enough to really splinter the Mithrim infantry line, but maybe it wasn't fast enough before all of these missiles were able to get into place. I think the Knights of the Golden Flower should really be getting in behind enemy lines as well and starting to really put pressure on all of these javelins and archer units, which are becoming more and more of a thorn in the side of this advance. They should still be feeling fairly confident in the fact that they can continue their advantage. Well, there goes the Gondolin General. Routing them is a difficult task, given their high-tier nature, but Hewing Guildsmen of Androth doing very well, actually, against the Axemen of the Pillar Dragon Guard and the Mighty Sons of Hurin. Really, again, showcasing their worth to the Mithrim line. Bannerets of the Hithershore getting out of the way there. Dragon Guard of Dorlomin. That's a lot of sword bearers of Mithrim that are routing. Bad tidings for them, and it does of course mean that these hunters will be engaged in melee as well. More of these javelins now tied up. The more that happens, the better the Noldor will be feeling about things. The Knights of the Golden Flower are now moving forward. This is going to be bad tidings for the hunters. Engaged by a unit stronger than them in melee on foot, and crunched by a unit of lance cavalry, although these fire arrows having a bit of an effect, although all of these units are now shaken as a result of the effects of that. Catapult crews coming in, hitting their own now abandoned catapult. We're getting a nice hit into the spearmen of the Swallow as well. Meanwhile, here in the middle, we did mention earlier on how choke point fights like this are exactly the sort of thing which the Noldor will prefer. Admittedly, we go back up to 1 speed. They haven't really made much progress in terms of territory. And I think, again, it's more a case of the javelin support in behind managing to be the leveller here. As much as the Noldor do have all of that muscle up front, they have been bled out at the wrists slightly, not only on the flank where Gondolin are attacking, but also here in the middle where Fingolfin are trying to also gain some map control. So now, I think perhaps unsurprisingly as a result of that, we're starting to see a little bit of more movement from Finarfin. Things not looking quite so rosy elsewhere now. Spear host of Gellion moving forward. Well, not moving forward, but ready to meet the advance of Finarfin. They will do so, but I can't imagine this front line is going to last all that long, given the robust nature of this Finarfin advance. Earthen Tower moving forward, Mithrim. There's a lot of armour piercing bound up in these kind of units, but maybe a little bit too far away from the front line. We may be hoping to gain the surprise against some cavalry units initially, but that did not last very long. Maybe a little bit of a misstep there from Ossiriand to leave those units so isolated, and this is where that aggression to try and root out the guerrilla tactics of a faction like Ossiriand can really pay dividends. Of course, being aggressive can also lead to you wandering aimlessly into the traps they laid, but on this occasion I think Ossiriand were kind of hoping Finarfin would stay back a little bit longer. Forward come the Ents now. Of course, the Ents, another very good tool for really doing a lot of damage very, very quickly. Though as elephant class units, I do believe they are actually subject to enhanced damage at the hands of stuff like pikes, so they do need to be careful of bridge wards. Though, now that they do class as elephants, they are an incredibly damaging unit as well. And immediately these regular medium infantry units of Finarfin are going to start to struggle. Going to need something a little bit more Lancers of Adorant in behind lines as well. So that initial sacrificial line of spears not doing quite so well. Fingolfin going to try and wrap around too, but we're really going to see the situation develop rather quickly here. Lancers of Adorant, another light cavalry unit that are capable of doing a lot of damage off the charge. I mean, it's bold to charge into the Sartor Finderato. If they turn around as a heavy spear unit, they're going to do damage pretty quickly, but to try and shave off those hit points with a cheeky charge is not the worst idea in the world. Defenders of Falathrim in reloading. The scouts also moving forward. Yeah, starting to see the Ents fall away fairly quickly. The added damage from those spears certainly helping out. We have over here. I think actually we are going to need to go down to half speed again now that there are many engagements across the field. Spearmen of the Swallow still moving forward. A lot of out-of-ammunition skirmishers at this point, making up a decent portion of the Gondolin force. Yeah, as much as that was a scary assault that they had to withstand over here, Mithrim, I think they have managed to do so. They've got enough in the way of numbers, individual quality perhaps not. Outriders of Dweilwyn as well. They still have those Knights of the Golden Flower, but only 21 of them now, and they don't have... I mean, there are the Sons of Hurin, of Fingolfin, so they do have some individual quality left, but not in the numbers that would be required, I think, to be able to destroy Mithrim over here. So I think the Sindar are going to win over here. They're not going to have an absolutely giant force left with which they can reinforce their allies over on the other side, should Finarfin really start to pick up the pace. But Mithrim will be very happy with that. Nice support as well, being run by the Falathrim. Has that come at the cost of them sacrificing too much of the middle? I'm not sure, you know. They still have reinforcements back here, including their own heavy units. The Orankialim still yet to be committed. The catapults back here, the javelins, which have been so important for their efforts. I mean, let's not forget, without these javelins, they almost certainly would have been subject to the superior melee quality that Fingolfin brings to the table. But Finarfin are also now over here too with some stalkers. Marines of Vinyamar moving forward. There's still Barad-Ithel units, though we're starting to see more and more, you know, again, marksmen of Barad-Ithel, herdsmen of Hithlum. Actually, we do have a unit of Orankialim in melee, and we may actually be starting to see the Falathrim claim the edge as the heavier faction here in the middle as well, so they would have felt fairly confident about their chances initially here, Fingolfin, but that has been undone, and very fair play to the Falathrim for doing so. The Falathrim are a slightly tricky faction to figure out how to play, given the necessity for combined arms, but I think on this occasion you've seen how effective that can be. And of course this has also freed up the champions of Eglares to run support for Ossiriand, who do probably need it given the compromised nature of this flank at the hands of yet more of Fingolfin's support for their allies on the flank. Randirim firing away as well, ripping through this glut of both Fingolfin and Finarfin units. The Mithrim fighting hard on the front line, but you can see here the pikes are down. A privilege that Finarfin, among the elves at least, jealously guard those pikes. The Ents fell away fairly fast, actually. Warns of Nargothrond going up against a combination of Kinsman and the Earthen Tower, but heavy spears combined with the damage of those axes, pretty good there, at least in a micro engagement for Ossiriand. The Lancers of Adorant as well. I have to say, in spite of the lighter nature of Ossiriand's cavalry, they've been one of the key factors here, both for Ossiriand in their own engagement and of course the Outriders of Dweilwyn helping Mithrim out on the other side. All of those kills really do add up. So now getting a bit of a hand as well from the melee cavalry of the Falathrim. And this really has been the clash of styles, whether the heavy infantry and offensive tactics that come with that of the Noldor, whether that would be successful, or whether not having access to quite the same level of expertise in that regard, but really relying a little bit more on your supporting units, cavalry, lighter cavalry as well, archers and javelins, would have the Sindar win. And it's, I mean, the Sindar have done very well for themselves here. We can see over here as well the Ondo Hyando out here on the flank, an armour-piercing archer, of course. They are a little bit isolated, but at this point in time, of course, both sides looking a little bit beleaguered, so cavalry is in shorter supply. I think that was Fingolfin's general as well. I don't know if Fingolfin can afford to lose a general like that. I mean, the Sons of Hurin are very, very dangerous, of course, but that was most unfortunate. Lookouts of Mithrim taking a crunching charge from the Knights of the Golden Flower. All is not lost for the Noldor over on this side, leaning on quality like this, but they're going to need the Knights of the Golden Flower to continue to do that. But again, bannerets of the Hither Shore are going to be able to do that for the Sindar as well, and they've got the support of the Outriders of Dweilwyn, which has been one of the main problems here. As scary as the infantry force was, the surrounding factors were in favour of the Sindar, and that they have been able to press home their advantage in that regard. Dragon Guard are running, Scouts of the Tree are wavering. I'm actually surprised to see there's only 3 of them left, but the Scions of Tuor, among bodyguards here, units in Silmarillion, do have a tendency to die off fairly quickly, as you would expect, given their complete lack of armour. But they've done pretty well for themselves here, as maybe you would expect against an armoured faction like Gondolin. I don't know how many kills they would have got. I mean, we will be able to see it. We are viewing this battle from Mithrim's perspective, after all, and I am interested to see that. And we haven't really been able to see them directly, because as is wise, they have been constantly in and amongst other Mithrim units. Bannerets of the Hithershore getting a good charge. Sons of Hurin will probably fight to the bitter end, but it will be a bitter end. Scouts of the Tree running. Still a fair amount of Hewing Guildsmen of Androth, honestly, and also stuff like Eglarest class units are going to be valuable reinforcements for elsewhere on the field. Actually, you know what, we can go up to 1 speed now, I think. I think it's kind of last throw of the dice here in the middle time for Fingolfin as they move forward their final line, their final wave, comprised of those herdsmen of Hithlum and the Marines of Vinyamar. Cavalry flitting around in the background, champions of Eglarest. I mean, the Aran-Kia Lim's presence on the front line means that even a desperate last gasp charge from Fingolfin isn't going to be enough to dislodge the Falathrim here. I think they are going to have victory as well, which means if the Noldor are to win, I think it is going to have to come about as a result of a Finarfin victory against Ossiriand. And the Pikes have certainly done their bit here. The Mithrim struggling on the end of this House Finarfin phalanx. Scouts of Tuor and Falathrim. Yeah, Finarfin are going to win over here, and they are going to have a decent amount left over. Those sacrificial lines of Ossiriand, I mean, it was always going to be tough. I think Finarfin did well by being decisive and committing forward their whole army. Ossiriand have to meet that challenge somehow, and the way their army was laid out initially wasn't really ready for the full brunt of that kind of assault. What have we over here as well? Herdsmen of Hithlum. So they're going to try and surround the Falathrim at this point. So this is a key moment in the battle now. What is going to happen? Champions of Eglarest are going to be able to slow the inevitable attempt at a surrounding motion here from those Fingolfin troops, and they don't need to hold on or hold back the Finarfin surround for too long. I mean, the herdsmen of Hithlum are already breaking after all. Primarily human units left, and Stalkers of Tuor and Faroth. Many of these units will be able to turn around without too much to concern themselves with. The Aran-Kia Lim still reasonably healthy as well. So it's not just going to be any old unit which is going to have to, which is going to be able to finish them off. There is, of course, the small matter of the arrival of some fairly healthy Hewing Guildsmen as well. So I would back the Sindar to get the job done here, even in spite of the Pikes. And I mean, Fingolfin has to try and make something happen quickly here, but I think not being able to wait for the additional help that Finarfin would be able to provide means that they are still a little bit splintered, the Noldor, and they need to be consolidated here if they were to have a shot at salvaging the situation. There's still some Blade Masters, a fair number of Blade Masters as well, now trying to envelop what remains of the Falathrim here in the middle. Champions of Eglarest, good opportunity for a rear charge here. Just going to try and rout off a lot of these units, I would assume. Still some Bladesmen, though wavering, and with a charge from these champions, surely that will be the end of them. As soon as it becomes a one-dimensional engagement once more, the numbers should see the Sindar over the line. And the slippery slope of continuous morale issues is going to start to come into effect as well. Rangers of Brithombar, starting to see some more Finarfin units arrive now. I have to say, a little bit slow on on the response here from Mithrim. A lot of these units are quite far over here. Bannerets of the Hither Shore don't really need to be over here either. Getting a little bit greedy with feasting upon their defeated foe in Gondolin, I think. When really, they could have got away with doing that with less, I think. And I think that they'll be fine anyway because of the amount of units that the Falathrim still have left. But that kind of decision could very well have come back to haunt the SINDAR in different circumstances. Finarfin may well have been victorious, but I don't think it will turn out to be to a great enough extent to salvage this fight for them. Victory seems certain. Only a fool could lose this battle. Yeah, the Iran kill him as well. Having 2 units of them to use later in the fight, given how defensively savvy they are, and Fingolfin, their armour-piercing units, other than the Sons of Hurin, do come from basic human units, which can't really live with high-end elven units like this in terms of overall skill and long-term survivability. There's a lot of things which could have gone differently in this fight, but overall, I think you have to say, a very well-deserved victory for the SINDAR here. Not the strongest in terms of outright might in comparison to the Noldor they were facing. But you really saw the virtue here of really having a well-crafted support system around your infantry force. As much as their infantry and their initial lines were certainly not of the same level of quality, the support around them meant that they were able to win, and in certain cases fairly comprehensively. I think obviously Finarfin won overall against Ossiriand on that flank, albeit in only a fairly minor capacity. Mithrim of course were able to defeat Gondolin and Fingolfin in a fairly costly affair, but I think here in the middle, even with the support around them, I'm still fairly surprised with how well the Falathrim were able to do against Fingolfin. Then again, Fingolfin did commit a fair amount of their energy to the 2 flanks as well, and to only win 1 engagement and to have it be the least convincing opening victory on the field, maybe that's something that could have been looked at, but I don't really think that Fingolfin was doing anything wrong by approaching the battle in that fashion, because the thinking there would of course be that you can overwhelm the 2 flanks with sheer quality and sheer muscle, and then of course you can move in on the middle, and even if the Falathrim post up in the middle, your superior heavy units are still going to see you over the line then. So the thinking was solid, but in the end, I think a very well-deserved victory for the SINDAR focus to actions here. Let's see what did the damage for Mithrim then. I am quite interested, and 247 on the Scions of Tuor, so they were in and amongst other units, a fairly small unit as well, so difficult to really see them truly shine, but I think here you see just how useful they could be against Armourers of the Hammer. Pretty much the ideal kind of unit for them to go up against as well, because they do outstrip them in terms of individual quality, and the Armourers of the Hammer themselves are not set up for fighting a unit like the Scions of Tuor, and the Armourers themselves of course also represent a very high value target to crunch through with those Thor-like hammers that the Scions have. The rest of the Mithrim army, however, perhaps unsurprisingly given the kind of force that Gondolin is, not getting huge amounts of kills, because Gondolin are a fairly small force anyway, but still 190 on the bannerets of the Hither Shore, and given how much investment Gondolin put into their own cavalry, that's not the kind of numbers Gondolin would like to see, still. And the Hewing Guildsmen, again, none of them breaking 100 kills, but still, based on the kind of units they were facing off against, that's not terribly surprising either. And it was never going to be a case of upfront muscle really being the reason for victory here. It was always going to be supporting units, as we saw play out across all of the SINDAR today. So I think that's fair enough. Catapult as well, 50 kills, you know, not terrible. I think Gondolin were always going to move forward and be somewhat aggressive anyway, but the Catapult of course can make someone bring forward their plans a little bit more. Ossiriand got the most kills in all fairness of the SINDAR teams, in spite of the fact that they were the only ones of the SINDAR to actually lose their initial engagement, but I guess that does go to show how many more units they were maybe facing off against here, and you can see certainly the Gondolin army was notably the smallest of the Noldor, and indeed Ossiriand was notably the smallest of the SINDAR. So it's one of those things, I suppose. You can only really kill what's in front of you, after all, in these games, and yeah. So big thank you to Leech for sending this one in. Nice to see another Silmarillion battle here, especially one with something of a theme, which is a little bit rarer in Silmarillion, because after all, most of the battles I get sent are sort of testing of new updates and the like. So it's quite rare that we get to see a battle with a theme. Although the siege that we saw last time of the Angband attack and this one between the Noldor and the Sindar do represent a bit of a change in that, and hopefully we'll be able to continue that. And indeed, in kind of a parallel thing, I mean, big thank you to Leech and all the players for sending this battle replay in and making it happen, of course. But with regards to the channel itself, there will be a channel update fairly soon. I will be thinking about, well, by the time this battle comes out, it'll probably be towards the tail end of June. I think I'm going to be thinking about doing a restructure of the channel. I think it's kind of necessary at this point, regardless of what happens in the near future or further future. And part of that is going to be me being a little bit more selective with what I show. I mean, it has been a little bit more quantity over quality lately, and that's not a slight against this battle or anything like that. But I've been showing just sort of battles of all sorts of descriptions, whereas I do think I think I need to be a little bit more discerning with what battles I actually show. Like, it's the sort of thing which can be talked about in a little bit more detail in said channel update video, rather than wedged at the end of one of these like this. But just know that there will be a channel update video fairly soon, and it will be me talking about a restructure of the channel a little bit. So I think it is kind of necessary. I think I do need to change things up a little bit, because it needs to be happening independently as well. I've been kind of putting it off for quite a while, because I've been kind of expecting to move employment for a while at this point, and it may be happening soon. But I kind of need to just treat that as something completely separate, and the channel itself, something needs to change on it anyway. And I think a restructure will be good for it. So it's not going anywhere, but there will be a few changes on the horizon, which I think will be good for everyone involved. So yeah, big thanks to all the players once again. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.